Hello and welcome to the virtual AWP Conference and Book Fair. I am Mimi Herman, Vice Chair of the AWP Board of Directors. For accessibility, I'd like to offer a physical description of myself. I am an olive-skinned woman with brown eyes and curly dark hair highlighted with gray. I'm wearing a teal sweater and silver earrings. We're delighted to bring you this event today, Disability's Influence on Literature, Realism as a Craft Concept, sponsored by AWP. Before we introduce our featured presenters, a thank you to all of our conference sponsors and partners for their support and participation. This conversation was pre-recorded and is premiering on March 3rd from 1:30 p.m. to 2:45 p.m. Central Time. This conversation will be followed by a live Q&A with the presenters. After the conclusion of this event, the video will be available for on-demand viewing. This event is being live captioned through Stream Text. Please find the link to access Stream Text from your browser in the event description. A transcript of the event will be available for on-demand viewing. During the live event, please enter your questions or comments into the platform chat box on the right of the screen. The moderator will be taking questions posted to that chat box. If you are watching on demand, feel free to continue to leave comments in the chat box to the right of the video. We thank you so much for attending and for your continued support of AWP. We hope you enjoy the event.
Welcome to the panel, Disability's Influence on Literature, Realism as a Craft Concept. I want to thank AWP for organizing this session and inviting me to moderate. It's really an honor. And I do want to acknowledge the glaring whiteness of our panel, but I hope that this can serve as an introduction to disability literature and that you'll venture forth after this and really seek out the multitudes of disabled writers that are in our community. My name is Marlena Chertock, she, her. I am a short white woman with short brown hair, wearing a maroon sweater and polka dot shirt underneath. I am a disabled queer woman, a poet, and literary organizer. I have 2 books of poetry, crumb-sized poems from Unnamed Press, and On That One-Way Trip to Mars from Bottle Cap Press. And I'm the co-chair of Outright, Washington, D.C.'s annual LGBTQ Literary Festival. And I also am honored to serve on the board of Split This Rock, which is a nonprofit that cultivates poetry that bears witness to injustice and provokes social change. In the spirit of identifying as disabled and connecting more with our diverse community, I want to share that I was born with a bone disorder called spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia. And it's actually a rare form of dwarfism that affects the joints, can cause scoliosis, chronic pain, and more. And disability is really vast and varied, and there's no one-size-fits-all narrative. And even with the same skeletal dysplasia, there's a huge gulf between me and my sisters and other family members' bodies and the way that we experience pain and move through the world. I just wanted to note that there's real power in language and naming something that for so long has been invisible or shamed, ignored, stereotyped, and it's essential to name disability and to promote our existence and identity, as well as to denounce ableism. There's an ongoing discussion on identity first versus person first language, for example, autistic person versus person with autism. But one thing should really be made clear, that disability is not a dirty word. And so with all that said, I'm really pleased to introduce our esteemed panel of disabled writers. They're going to pop up on your screen. Eileen Cronin's Mermaid, translated in 3 languages, was one of O Magazine's best memoirs of the year. She's held fellowships with Vermont Studio Center and American Psychological Association. She won the Washington Writing Prize in fiction, and she's a writing instructor and a psychologist at UCLA. James Tate Hill's memoir, Blind Man's Bluff, will be published by W.W. Norton in 2021. His fiction debut, Academy Gothic, won the Nielsen Prize for a first novel. He's the fiction editor for Monkey Bicycle and a contributing editor for Literary Hub, where he writes a monthly audiobooks column. The 2019 and 2020 editions of Best American Essays list his work among the notable essays. And last but not least, T.K. Dalton's writing has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize and Best of the Net and appears in Apogee, The Millions, Southeast Review, Tahoma Literary Review, The Common, Radical Teacher, and elsewhere. He recently completed work on The Intimate Register, a memoir for which he is actively seeking representation. A founding editor of the Deaf Poets Society, a digital journal publishing disability literature and art that will publish its 9th issue this spring, Tim has taught writing at the college level since 2005. He holds an MFA from the University of Oregon and is currently earning a PhD in English at the CUNY Graduate Center. Welcome to our really diverse and esteemed panel. So glad to have you join us. So with my introductory remarks in mind about disability, I'm curious to ask if you all identify as disabled or if there's another way you identify and what labels and language you use.
Thank you. First of all, I'll just describe myself. I am a middle-aged, well, actually I'm a 60-year-old woman. I've been writing since undergrad and have only really felt a part of the writing world in the last 10 years, I suppose, because of how I felt, you know, that I had to hide my identity. So this is a great question. You know, in the 80s, you were not allowed to be a disabled writer. You weren't really allowed to be a woman writer in the 80s, but a disabled writer was not even a thing. So I wanted to say that I'm pleased to be here and I'm grateful to AWP for this opportunity. I identify as a disabled writer or a writer with a disability. I don't really care. Either way is fine. I feel that we're erased in our society and that I'm seeing increasingly more erasure and replacement of the word underlying conditions, which I find really troubling because disability is everywhere. It's a very strong part of literature. Many great American writers have had disabilities. Fitzgerald had mental illness and alcoholism. Flannery O'Connor had lupus. Hemingway had a traumatic brain injury. David Foster Wallace had depression. We keep erasing the word disability and using it to exclude people by saying you can't do this because you're too disabled, and then replacing it with underlying conditions when we need help. And so I really feel very strongly now more than ever that we need to say the word disability to create solidarity in our community and push for change. Virtually every other marginalized identity is embraced in the arts today. And I agree that we need more people of color in the disabled community for sure, because the people most affected by the poverty that's happening in our country are people with both disabilities and economic hardship. Currently, I don't have an economic hardship, but I can tell you that at age 23, I was cut loose in the world with 2 artificial legs, no help, expectations to put myself through graduate school and fight with insurance companies the whole way through so that I could maintain legs and continue to get my education. That's America. That's my America. Here are the facts about disability that you don't hear. 80% of our homeless population are disabled Americans. This is proven. This is coming from the California Policy Lab that did a national study. also backed up by the LA Times, but you don't hear about it in our press. You don't hear about it in our literature. If I were 23 today and cut loose with my artificial legs, I'd be scared to death. I was scared to death then. There was no help for me. I'm able, I can get around, I can work. But then you go out and apply for a job and people will tell you you're disabled. Sometimes for jobs that have nothing to do with your disability. So having said all of that, I'm proud to call myself disabled. I'm not happy that we're using the word underlying conditions. If there's any dirty word, it's the underlying conditions. Thank you.
And is it me now?
Go ahead, James.
Thanks. And thank you, Marlena, and thank you, AWP. And yeah, I'm James Tate Hill, and describing myself is not something I do regularly, but I'm average height. I was average weight before the pandemic, and now I'm probably more than average weight. But my disability is at age 16, I developed Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy. So it's very large blind spots in the central field of my vision. So I have some sort of lingering peripheral vision that allows me to do some things, but for better and worse. And a big part of my own personal narrative with disability is you can probably tell from the title of my memoir, Blind Man's Bluff, is trying, much to the detriment of my own happiness, to pass for sighted for more than a decade and a half. And so I resisted those terms. I resisted the term blind, which felt like a dirty word, because I was trying to remove myself from situations where I could be perceived as having any sort of physical impairment at all. So again, refusing to identify as disabled or blind was the central narrative of my life for about a decade and a half. And you know, in those rare situations where I did have to pick a term, I would insist on visually impaired. In part, in my mind, I thought, well, blind means totally blind, like you can't see anything, even though, as we've already established, disability is never a one-size-fits-all, and definitely the blindness community can attest to the uniqueness of everyone's blindness. But for me, I'm sure now looking back, it was far less semantics and accuracy of that description than it was just internalized shame, which came from what Eileen was talking about, is the simple erasure of disability from our society. And I know I'll talk as we get further into this about where that internalized shame comes from. But I mean, I would do mental gymnastics in my head to not think of myself as blind, even though obviously could not drive, could not read, could not recognize faces, I could walk around, but not really knowing where I was unless I had memorized my path somewhere. And so I would think, well, in New York, people don't drive. I'm not blind, I'm a New Yorker. And so I would have these very convoluted ways of trying to perceive myself. And what I realize now, looking back, now that I have no problem using the term disability and blind, that there's no stigma to those terms. It's just stigma that comes from internalized shame.
Thanks, James. So hi, I'm Tim, TK Dalton. He, him, his are my pronouns. I'm a white man with a beard, a pandemic style beard, some glasses, and a faded corduroy jacket that looks pretty good on Zoom, I like to think. There's some kid art behind me covering up some of the marks on the wall. I come to you from Texas, from my mother-in-law's ironing room. So this is how we work now. I'm so happy to be here on this panel. I want to thank everyone for organizing it and for saying such really interesting things so far. So I do identify as disabled, but usually with a sort of noun after it. It's a modifier of some other type of thing. And so, a disabled writer, a disabled instructor, a disabled parent, a disabled New Yorker. And I think for me, part of what's important about identifying as disabled, whatever comes after that is it makes disability both visible and narrative. My disability is mostly invisible. It's a brain injury, which was part of a treatment for some tumors that I was born with. But those tumors also caused epilepsy, which is an on and off condition, right? It's temporally located, right? So this idea of now you see it, now you don't, makes the storytelling aspect of disability identity super important to me. I should also say that, identity is fluid and position is situational and all those sorts of academic-y sounding things, right? Like where you tell a story from affects what the story is. I come from a special needs family, which is to say that like my dad's late deafened, my brother's on the autism spectrum. So the three men in my family, including myself, all have very particular relationships to disability, including to that word. And I'm the gymnastics that we've all been doing, what James was just saying really resonated with me. So yeah, I'm excited to talk about that and all this stuff. So thank you.
Thank you all, and really thanks for being so radically open and honest on these really intimate details of your lives. It's just really inspiring. Without inspiration porn, just like inspiring for me to be in community with you. So yeah, I want to recognize that the COVID-19 pandemic has sickened and killed people with disabilities, people of color, Indigenous peoples at higher rate than others due to systemic healthcare inequities as well as racism. And like Eileen was saying earlier, disability and lack of accessibility is a social justice and human rights issue. And COVID has really completely transformed how we work, access our needs and entertainment, and what is deemed essential. Work, author events, movies, more. AWP has all moved remote and online, and there's a real plethora of virtual platforms that we've had to all get familiar with now. And this shift to all virtual has provided increased accessibility for many, but also exposed limitations of technology and inaccessibility for others. And since, AWP 2021 itself is a virtual conference this year, and I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the disabled writers and activists who've been pushing for that increased accessibility for years and whose shoulders we're really standing on now. And just note that it's important to know that this is a work in progress and a journey, and we've come far and that more work remains. So with all that said, I'm curious for each of you, how accessible has the move to all virtual been for you? And how can literary festivals, conferences, residencies, workshops, journals, our literary community be made more accessible spaces? And how can we try not to just go back to a normal that really didn't work for all of us?
So we're reversing the order now. So there's a lot to say. My response to this, which is a conversation that happens a lot, how do we take what's good about this COVID period and keep it, and get rid of the stuff that was bad before? And my answer always sounds like the answer of a 20-year-old philosophy student. We have to reorient our relationships to time and space, right? One of the really interesting things about this panel, right, is it's happening in 3 different time locations, right? We're recording it, you're watching it, and then you can have access to it in the future. And I think like that stretching of time can be very disability friendly, right? I also think we should really revisit the idea of space. I love literary events that happen in grimy dive bars, but those grimy dive bars don't always have ramps, right? And those sorts of things, right? So this sort of new norm of meeting in spaces that are technologically mediated, insofar as those are accessible pretty universally, is super important. And I hope that, I think that's kind of increasingly a requirement of this work. The one other thing I'll say is I'll just kind of talk about the workshop, the creative writing workshop, which in my experience as a student many years ago, I found generally kind of not, I think there's like a model of workshopping, the what works, what doesn't, that rests on this notion of literary merit, but I think doesn't examine its assumptions about ability and narrative very closely. Models like that are more descriptive, right? What happens in this story, who's in this story, what kind of language do you see, and what's it about, right? That sort of offers more access into the story for narratives and structures, narrators and structures in particular, that can resist some of the tendencies and tropes that readers sometimes expect when they haven't examined their own ableist assumptions. So anyway, I think there's a lot of work still to do, but we're living in an exciting time to do that work.
Thanks, DK. I will say two of the lessons that stand out most for me about the pandemic is that, as you said, Marlena, in the opening, and as Eileen said in her opening answer, the disabled community has been hit harder by the pandemic than other groups, than almost any other group. At the same time, the disabled community is where so much of the wisdom and ability to adapt, the lessons that mainstream society is taking from the pandemic is coming from the disability community. How do you make the most, and how do you adapt in what seems an untenable situation? And it's gratifying, but it's also frustrating because, as you've alluded to, Marlena, there have been people before us, many generations before us, who have fought for access, people who have fought to make conferences virtual and been constantly denied. And I don't think it escapes anybody's purview that now all these conferences are virtual, when many disabled people have been angling for that out of necessity. And now that the mainstream world needs it, it's okay. And the central lesson that tells us is that accessibility and accommodations are almost never about can't, it's about won't. And I mean, speaking from my own experience, audiobooks used to be almost exclusively available for the blind, and they would record for the Library of Blind and Physically Handicapped, is what it used to be called, from the Library of Congress. And then suddenly they become something that the mainstream culture embraces with the invention of smartphones. And now everything gets recorded. So as long as there is a financial gain or benefit for the larger number, these changes can almost always be done. And to echo what TK said about so many of these events being virtual, I do think that's gonna linger and I hope it does. And it's gonna make things much more accessible for people who have wanted this out of necessity for years, now that the rest of the country needs it too.
Thank you, everyone. I would like to start by asking ourselves if a writing life is even possible for disabled writers who aren't at least middle class. The majority of disabled Americans are below the poverty level. And if we look up in the US Census, we have a huge problem with poverty in our whole entire country. So this is a group of people who are at the very bottom being pressured. Well, I agree that we definitely need to do more to get within our caucus and our community more writers of color with disabilities. I think we need to ask other marginalized groups, are they including disabled people from their groups on panels? Because those are often the most challenged people in our society. So I think that we need to just start asking a lot more and speaking up for ourselves, not apologizing for what we aren't, but for saying we are doing the best we can and we are getting almost no help or recognition in the process. There are many retreats and conferences that offer funding and don't offer funding or even acknowledge disability as a marginalized group. There's just something very strange about that. In some cases, those places aren't accessible. That's the bottom line. Institutions are not acknowledging us as a endangered species, which we are in the pandemic. In England, the National Bureau of Statistics did a follow-up of who is getting COVID the most, and they have reported that 2/3 of the cases of deaths have been disabled people. I haven't heard a word about the word disability in all of the pandemic on our news, hardly anything. TK mentioned that he has epilepsy. He probably may not have even heard this, but I just read a report that people with epilepsy, cerebral palsy, and other people with developmental disabilities are at extremely high risk. And we don't hear anything about it. It's as if we are expendable people, that America can just do without us. And therefore, we do have to try to fit in, which is what people have addressed. We do have to keep trying to make it look like we aren't disabled. And we are still doing our jobs and getting very little help in the process or even recognition for what's actually going on with us. Thanks.
Thank you all. Those are really, really important points, and I really appreciate your thoughts. I want to move on to something underlying that we've been kind of talking about. Growing up, I personally didn't really see much representation of myself, my body, or my skeletal dysplasia in books or media. Maybe I saw a bit of myself in Judy Blume's Beanie, but there's really such a lack of disability representation. And often when we are portrayed, it's from a non-disabled or even ableist perspective. So I'm curious your thoughts. Growing up, did you have many representations of yourself or your disability in books, in literature? And also, what kind of disability narratives do you think are most often allowed to be told or are published by the literary establishment? And Eileen, if you wanted to start.
Okay, well, come on, a book or a film with a real woman with an amputation, come on. There are only 3 to 4 million amputees in America. And who sells 3 million books, right? Even 30,000 books. Do you think that people, if they actually knew that there was a book out there by someone with an amputation who has an amputation, wouldn't be highly interested in that book? But that's the problem. You can publish a book. You can publish a book with a great publishing house. Say JT is publishing with Norton, that's where I publish. But very few people are going to hear about your book if you're disabled. Nobody's going to put a lot of money into that. That's the truth. And that's not acceptable. Editors and agents will tell you, I really love your writing. It's so beautiful, but it's so sad. Well, if you actually read some of our work, it's hilariously funny. But you are saying that it's sad because you are labeling us as disabled. Then we're going out into the world and we're being told underlying conditions, no room for any accommodations or help for disabled people. Are you beginning to see that there's a pattern here? It's called censorship. That's what's going on. It's in Hollywood in spades. I tried to do an interview with disabled screenwriters once. I called the Writers Guild. It took them about 6 emails to gather up 4 disabled screenwriters in all of the Writers Guild. That's for a population of 58 million people, okay? Then after I got these 4 people to agree to let me interview them, I could not get even a response from the Hollywood Reporter, Variety, or the LA Times to write such an article, because why? I'm a disabled writer. So it's really not fair that we're not being included in a time when everyone is under siege. And we've been so erased that no one remembers that we exist, even in a pandemic. So yeah, I think, again, this is a question of solidarity, asking, it kind of is our fault too. We don't join together and say, this is unacceptable. We can't be erased anymore.
Thank you, Eileen. And echoing that, and it's almost embarrassing to me how long it has taken me to learn so many of these lessons. But I mean, what I think would have been a faster path to self-acceptance for me would have been greater representation in media and pop culture and literature, and to see stories where people are not just accent marks and not just stereotypes, but people are the same 3-dimensional heroes with disabilities or disabled heroes, and not people who just happen to have a disability and are taking up some sort of background space for the purpose of furthering the main character's story. And in the interest of brevity, I'm going to move past the rest of my comments here, because I really, really want to read this short passage from a writer named Amanda Leduc, Leduc, and this will be in our access document. She writes so smartly and so movingly about being moving through the world with cerebral palsy, and just an FYI for anybody in the audience, I use a screen reader, and so I will slow that down, and the voice in my ears will become the voice in my throat, and I'm going to read this from an essay from Literary Hub called Monster or Marvel, where she writes about being disabled in a superhero world. And she writes about the portrayal of superheroes and the kinds of stories that are allowed to be told. And here she goes. But my walk, my legs, my body, I am, all of me, a feature. We are, all of us, a feature. I have no fairy godmother because I have no need of one. I am not waiting for an unconventional white knight to come crashing up a causeway to my castle, because I have seen the castle and its darkest heart, and nothing in it scares me anymore. I have no need of rescue. I want more than the stories that posit the strong as those who survive and protect the rest of us. I want stories where people are not applauded for embracing difference, but instead reshape the world so that difference is the norm. I have nothing to prove to the world because the world has everything to prove to me. It is the world's responsibility to make space for my body, my words, my lopsided gait, our bodies, our words, our ways of moving through the world. To hold my childhood dreams of being a princess and a superhero close and help me understand that there is no need to want to be either. To start telling different stories about a body that might just look like mine and reshaping the world to fit them. And I would just circle back to highlight the way she put that was an epiphany for me, even in the midst of my pre-existing self-acceptance, but the framing of disability as a feature and not a lack was really important for me to read when that essay came out. Thank you.
James, that is so gorgeous and important. And I think that focus on what we know from our embodied experience is so crucial. And one of the things that I've been thinking about as everyone has been talking. we've brought up COVID-19 already, and one of the things that I see a lot in some good reporting about COVID is how long it takes to recover, if at all, and how long the disease impacts people. And I think that ongoingness of disease, for someone who was born with brain tumors and spent about 15 years in and out of Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, right, as a child, right, like that ongoingness is like, I know that from my own embodied experience. And I think disabled people know different things that it's very timely for us to be sharing in narrative form that people can connect to other experiences that we're all going through as a society, right? The importance of care relations is another such example, right? Eileen brought up amputees and stories about amputees. In my PhD life, I'm spending a lot of time looking at a left-handed penmanship contest from the Civil War, where essentially a bunch of guys who had lost their right arms in the Civil War wrote brief personal narratives to a veterans magazine, right? Explaining how they lost their arm and how they relearned handwriting, right? So this act of literacy and storytelling to an audience of people who are going through the same thing. It's not so different than the work that we did at the Deaf Poets Society, or that happens at Word Gathering or in other literary circles that focus on disability and support disabled stories, where those narratives are allowed to flourish amongst audiences who understand that there is special knowledge, right, from the embodiment that we variously walk around with, right? People launch off and then are understood by that broader culture who doesn't quite understand what we understand, which is how disability can make visible other systems of oppression that need reform or abolition. Thanks.
Thank you all so much. I'm just still digesting everything and really, really connect with what you all were saying about just that deep understanding and knowledge that disabled folks bring to this long-lasting disease or invisible illness or whatever it might be. Yeah, I think you're right that number one, representation is important, and if there's a lack, that's a big problem. And number two, we really do need to be doing much more of it, and it comes from us and also the outside community who's not disabled. I wanted to move into craft, and I find myself really drawn to more to poetry and the use of line breaks and metaphors about nature or outer space to be able to express chronic pain in my own body. And so I'm curious for you, how does disability interact on the page? And in terms of craft and disability, are there certain literary devices in your toolbox that you're more drawn to, or are you more drawn to a certain genre or others?
Okay, I'm going to try to be as brief as possible, though I could talk about this forever. If we had a bar, I would say let's go and talk there about it. But basically, I'm a prose writer, and so a lot of my work has very 19th century roots, and disability as a pathology, coincidentally, also has those roots. So there's a lot of work one has to do. So I'll say two quick things. One of them is I like that sort of happy medium length, 2,000 to 5,000 kind of length of an essay kind of thing. But I have to do a lot of navigating of readers' expectations about what should and shouldn't happen. So I think there's a lot that the short form and that multimodal forms have to suggest for disabled folks. I also think that chronology and horology are often at war in my work, at the sentence level, at the level of structure, because I think what I want to represent is sort of I don't know, like a sort of anti-linearity of experience that comes from having a body that's basically split in half. One, a left side that's very, very weak, a right side that compensates a lot for it, and just like the metaphor that suggests, you're smart, you can make it yourself. But I think that also suggests one thing doesn't always lead to another in a linear way. So I definitely resist that. And that's not always received as intentional or, appropriate or effective. which I think has something to do with what we think organization and narrative structure is. So.
I would say my breakthrough in writing about my blindness coincided with discovering second person. And I would be remiss if I didn't give a hat tip to Mark Richard and his memoir, House of Prayer #2, where most of the book is in second person. And it just was a revelation when I started writing in the second person that I was discovering how to write about myself in a much more open and honest way than I ever had, because of course, as I've already said, I never even would confront my blindness, let alone write about it on the page. And so I think disabled writers, like many marginalized writers, possess this double consciousness where you're viewing yourself from the outside in as the rest of the world sees you. And the second person point of view, that constant you, where you're addressing yourself from the outside in, really felt right to me, especially when I was writing. Not all the chapters, just I think 3 of the chapters in my memoir are in second person. And those are the chapters where I felt least connected to a sense of self and most confused about which me I was going to be able to be.
Thanks a lot, guys, both of you. Those were great answers. I'm drawn mostly to realistic fiction. I've always, was started out as a fiction writer and then decided to write a memoir because I grew up, I was born out of a mass catastrophe. And it was one that really hasn't been documented or covered in our culture, because in America, we said we didn't have any problems with thalidomide because it was never approved. But in fact, 20,000 people received the drug in the United States in a clinical trial. So I am very much a person grounded in fact. That's why I keep popping up with statistics. But I love storytelling, and I think that storytelling actually influences our culture more than any facts. And if we don't know that now by what's going on in our country, we're never going to learn that. So memoir has become a great way of, pushing forward ideas, and it's a part of activism that's very critical in our culture. And I think it's very important. In terms of craft, I love Flannery O'Connor. I've loved her long before I even realized that she had lupus. Her characters were dynamic and matchless because she understood the complexities of life with an illness. She is the queen of redemption and condemnation stories. And these themes are at the heart of what it means to live in America with a chronic illness, or just being different in any way in America. On the other hand, my favorite contemporary writer is Kazuo Ishiguro. And I teach 2 different courses at UCLA Extension. One is memoir, and the other one is survival stories, crafting survival stories. And I always start with Ishiguro because he was born in Nagasaki after the bomb. And he has such an interesting take on trauma. He then grew up in England, where everybody acts like, everything's fine all the time. So I think he has a wonderful, subtle sense of humor that, as a disabled person, just as every single person on this panel has pointed out, you spend much of your life pretending that every single thing is fine. Meanwhile, you've got like 15 different narratives going on in your head about how I better not move this way because my leg might fall off, or I better take that path because, I'm starting to get, a sore and it's going to be too hard. And you're just interacting with other people at the same time as though nothing is happening. So I feel like his books, Never Let Me Go and The Buried Giant, are excellent examples of dystopian novels that are told so completely differently. The Buried Giant is very fantastical, and it really talks about death and disease and memory loss. Never Let Me Go is about people who find out that they're clones who are going to be used for organ donations. And in all of these stories, everyone's being very normal and sort of carrying on. And I love him too, because he's able to immerse himself in any setting. This again is very much a disability story. You have to immerse yourself in any setting and make yourself adapt to that setting. What JT was reading is about saying, no, the world has to adapt to me. I agree with that. The world is supposed to adapt to us, but it isn't adapting to us. So I think we need to form more solidarity and start speaking up and calling this out in order to get the world. We've got to stop pretending nothing's wrong. But in the meantime, I think we should keep telling stories about how we pretend nothing's wrong, because that is very much an American story. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. I really relate to that, Eileen, of kind of just almost, I hate the word mask now because it has a different connotation, but I also experienced migraines, and I just remember, just putting on a mask and smiling and pretending I didn't have a terrible migraine during the workday and just going on like it was fine. But yeah, I think in some ways, the pandemic has really broken down some of those masks, and in other ways, it's really just created more issues. I wanted to ask if you all write about disability and your body and your experience. And so I'm just wondering, do you ever feel pigeonholed to only write about or speak on disability?
I guess this one's mine first. I would say that, in the 80s, when I was in grad school, as I said, there was no such thing as disability. It just didn't even exist. And it is often included as a prop in literature. It existed in literature, but as a prop to, further a story, make a protagonist look sympathetic because they're so kind to the disabled person, or sometimes they use disability as a metaphor for a rotten heart, like Captain Ahab, somebody who is just morally corrupted because of they've never gotten over their disability. So do I feel pigeonholed to speak on it? No, not at all. I was always writing fiction that had nothing to do with disability before. But now I do, in a way, feel pigeonholed because I'm so struck by how incredibly unrelenting our country has become towards this issue of healthcare. And this is, in fact, not even one of our newest president's top 5 priorities, which saddens me. I realize the world is a disaster, but we're in a pandemic. That's not cool. Just saying. But I would love to be able to write, like the novel that I'm working on now, I did not have a disabled person in it because that's how I used to write. And interestingly, I ended up deciding that one of the characters had a disability. And then I really connected to this story so much differently. That's only been in the last 6 months. And I've been working on it for years. And now I feel like the pieces of the puzzle were all in place, and that piece was missing. That's where everything kind of came together for me. So I don't know if it's about being pigeonholed or just saying, come on, this is 1 in 5 people in America. So it should be 1 in 5 characters in every book. Thank you.
Yeah, like Eileen, I had been writing probably the first 3-4 unpublished novels I had been working on had nothing to do with disability, because I was in a state of trying to hide that still. And then the first novel that I wrote with a blind protagonist was the novel that got published, Academy Gothic, which I think readers might view it as much as an academic satire or a murder mystery, but it's very much to me, it's first and foremost a disability narrative. And you know, of course, the memoir is what comes out next, and the novel that I'm working on now tackles disability, not through the main character, but through other characters. And if I'm honest, I don't find it to be a pigeonhole or a restriction, but I'm having come to this so late in life, this, you know, my identity snapping into place when the fog of denial clears. I actually find it really exhilarating to connect with characters. Like Eileen said, she now finds so much more connection with the character that has now become disabled in her novel. Same here. I feel like now I'm writing the books I was meant to write, and creating the characters that are hitting the page from the inside out rather than the outside in.
Well, thank you to both of you. I'm going to try to be brief just in the interest of time, but so I don't feel pigeonholed at all. I think of it more of just like my entry point into whatever it is that I'm writing, right? Disability is the point of view from which I think about a narrative that's about health versus one that's about illness versus one that's about work versus one that's about education versus anything else, right? I think what unites all of those things is care. And I think that's a topic that we're all thinking a lot about, care relations and how we interact with each other, how we think about the ripples of our actions. You know, as much as you spend much of your life pretending everything is fine, it's an American story, perhaps the new American story is, oh, my actions affect everyone. And I'm hopeful that that's the case, so.
Thank you all. I just wanted to note also our connection, that we've all participated in AWP's writer-to-writer mentorship program as mentees, mentors, and there's really a large disabled literary tradition that lives far beyond us as individuals. So I'm curious how important mentorship has been to you, and if you found a mentor or your writing community, and how. If you could just briefly talk on that.
Yes. Hi, Eileen. Eileen was my mentor through the AWP writer-to-writer program. And when we met, we had just, my second kid was just born, and I was just sort of finishing up a novel that I'm like, you know what, this is going to be published by the desk drawer. And I was like, let's try nonfiction. And Eileen really helped orient me towards like some of the things fiction, having written fiction can help you do, and some of the things nonfiction demands that fiction, you know, demands less loudly and insistently. But I think like that mentorship was crucial. But I also think for me, as someone who's sort of like, I was born pre-ADA, but I grew up post-ADA. I love interacting with writers who are like, there was a pre-ADA, right? Because I love that perspective. You know, I love the perspective of writers who grew up way pre-ADA. I just think that was 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was just this sea change. And I think mentorship that can talk across those lines is so crucial for our own historical memory, and, you know, to construct identity. You know, the world works against constructing identities amongst ourselves in certain ways, right? For certain communities, right? But then, just developing a shared history, mentorship is one of the things that can really make that vital. So that's what I love about mentorship.
Yeah, Eileen and I worked together too, and the absurd thing is that I was Eileen's mentor because she was switching genres from nonfiction to fiction, and I hope that was fruitful for her, but I am sure that I got so much more from her than she ever got from me, because she was very much my mentor in entering the disability community, where, as I've said 30 times already, I for years didn't identify and refused to identify, and therefore it was a willful ignorance about what kind of community is out there and how much there is to know and how much there is to learn. And she was one of the first people I called when my memoir sold, and it's just you can't say enough about how good it is for your work, but also your mental health, to know that there's a network of writers who are doing what you're trying to do. And I want to put in another plug for a book that's only 6 months old, called Disability Visibility by Alice Wong, who's a really important activist. And it's filled with essays from an extremely wide variety and diverse array of perspectives on the disability experience. I cannot emphasize enough how much you will get out of this book, Disability Visibility, edited by Alice Wong.
Thank you. I have, the mentorship really changed my whole relationship with AWP, which prior to the mentorship was minimal. I had the good fortune to be accepted on a panel in 2015 for the first time after publishing my book. I hadn't even been a member long, mostly because, as TK talked about pre-ADA, I was born in 1960 in the Midwest. There was no ADA. I went to a Catholic school. They still are not required to give accommodations. They definitely weren't giving them when I was growing up. And on top of that, it was that school that had all the best athletic programs in, the whole state. So it was really all about athleticism. What it taught me is how to toughen up and play the game, which I think has served me well. But again, I can't get anywhere without having some solidarity with other disabled people, because I have to talk about it to people. I have to get support from them. And we have to work together to ask for things that never existed before. And still don't exist. JT's book was published, is going to be published with my editor too. So I list Amy Cherry as the mentor-in-chief of disabled writers. I think we need more Amy Cherrys in the literary community. So yes, the mentorship has been amazing, and I strongly advise people to go, and I'm always willing to be a mentor. I've loved being a mentee, and James is totally understating his, he helped me a lot. He helped me mostly with PTSD from having published a memoir. So yeah, it's been great knowing both TK and JT. They've helped. TK totally introduced me to the whole world of disabled writers in AWP. I didn't even know they existed. Thank you.
I just wanted to wrap up and thank each of you for being a part of this fabulous panel. I've learned so much, and I'm really grateful to have moderated. Thank you to AWP for hosting us. And thank you all to joining us in the audience, and stay on a little bit because we're going to be opening up for some questions. Thank you all. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the lively chat. Really, really great to see your responses. I'm going to read 2 questions, and then maybe we can go through the lineup, Eileen, James, and TK. Excuse my cat, she likes to join. The first question is, should somebody submit their disability and old age poems to disability publications, which can feel like a ghetto, or should they try to get them into places that have a wider mission? So if you wanted to go through that question first.
Sorry, am I starting with that?
Go for it. Whoever has a response, feel free to jump in.
So I'll just throw out there, as someone who's settling into early middle age, I've been thinking a lot about age and how it overlaps with disability. So I think this questioner also had posed the question and asked us to talk about age. And I think age is one of these ways in which the changes of the body over time can be narrated really effectively. So tell that story, tell it as best as you can, tell it in a form that feels authentic, and then send it somewhere where you think it would make sense. That's not terribly great advice, except that I think aging is a story, and it's a embodied story. So like, let those details shape the story and shape where it goes.
Excuse me, and hi again, everybody. My philosophy on submitting is, if you believe in it, make an editor say no. Don't give up on the highest tier right out of the bat. If it's work you believe in and you think you've told the story as best as you can tell it, whether it's poetry or nonfiction or fiction, make somebody say no. And I do think literary magazines, I think our Access document tackles this question on which journals are open. And I know that's a very big question that could probably be its own panel, but I do think the literary magazine and journals are starting to publish a lot more disability work by disabled writers and recognize the value of these stories. I think that, I've observed that, but I also just hope that it's true.
I just want to, I think what both gentlemen just said, I totally agree with. I teach a memoir class, and I also teach a class called Crafting Survival Stories at UCLA Extension. And I tend to get a lot of people who've been through trauma or who have disabilities. Many don't even identify as disabled. Then they come to my class, and then I start to hear about all the disabilities they have. The usual issue is not going deep enough into it. I think we're so socialized, as we've been saying over and over again today, is, to hide our disabilities or downplay it. But usually the stories are much more interesting if we're willing to go a little deeper into what's actually going on. And the other thing I would say is always get a lot of readers before you submit and get some feedback, because sometimes we have a really unique perspective. Because I know for myself, I didn't know anyone else who was growing up with legs missing from below the knees, or this hidden scandal that I was trying to find out about myself that no one was talking about. So I have a very, very unique perspective, and I have to remind myself that not everybody else understands any of this stuff. And I need to get some readers who aren't familiar with disability to give me some feedback, so I can anticipate the questions that the audience and the readers might have. And sometimes we think people are dismissing us
But it may be that our work isn't ready yet. And we just need to get more readers and kind of get a better handle on the work itself before sending it out. Thanks.
Thanks, well, and we just have a few more minutes left, so I might lump two together. And I also just wanted to call out Zoe Glosia, which I may be mispronouncing, but it's a community that's been set up to offer residencies and community and support for poets with disabilities. So check that out. And there's so many resources like that are really starting up by disabled people, which is amazing, disabled writers. So we have two similar questions. Somebody's curious to hear thoughts on the use of ableist metaphors, like a real stand-up guy, to describe people. And if you have certain opinions about ableist metaphors like that, or if you try to avoid them in your writing, and also, I guess the connection or perhaps tension between people with physical disabilities versus invisible disabilities. If that brings up anything for you all, feel free to jump in.
I was muted myself because I cleared my throat. Sorry about that. I will take this and I would say that we all have, to use another bad metaphor because I have blind spots, but we all have blind spots, metaphorically speaking. And I think you're sensitive to your own particular language and situation, but whenever the word blind is used as a very common synonym for ignorant, really drives me up a wall. And there are so many of these things that are so ingrained in our language and our idiom that we don't realize are inherently based in. I'm sure there are articles that list so many of these. And I would encourage people to not be overly sensitive. You know, if somebody corrects us when we use these phrases and idioms, because they are, as so much of our culture, as we're coming on the heels of Dr. Seuss books, which are being pulled from publication due to very obviously racist imagery in some of them, and where it's if you sit down and you look at the origin of so many of these images and words, it's obvious that we should abandon so many of these things, and it's really just custom and obstinacy that's behind us continuing to use such things.
Just to piggyback on that, there are long and damaging histories behind most ableist metaphors. They're also pretty much all cliches. So you could probably find a better phrase and improve your writing and not be ableist all at the same time. So please do that.
Eileen, I think you might be muted if you're trying to talk.
I was answering a question online. Sorry. Just go ahead and skip me. Somebody had made a comment, so I wanted to answer them.
No worries at all. I think we only have 1 minute left, but maybe we can hear about, somebody asked, when editing, where do you draw the line between the realism of your disabled experience versus making something that really creates a clear story or poem or essay for the reader? So for instance, this person is writing about dissociating, and some editors and agents have told them they should say instead dreaming or italicize that sequence, even though that's not really their experience.
I will say that's a really, really good question. And it's a difficult question because I think so much of it depends on the work and the circumstance. But I think so many writers, bilingual writers or writers who are working in references to other cultures are so often edited unnecessarily or problematically to make their work accessible in a way that it means it's being watered down, it's being homogenized. And I would say the same applies to writers with disabilities or writers trying to communicate an experience. And I would say the problem there lies with editors and publishing more so than the problem of the writer.
And maybe that might be a great place to stop. I think we've run over our time, but just wanted to really thank you again to AWP for sponsoring this panel. Thank you to the incredible panelists and your incredible thoughts and sharing your experiences. And thank you as well to the hundreds of people who joined us today and in the future for this recording and for all of your comments. Really, really appreciate it all. And thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.